Happy Halloween. We're already recording. Welcome to the Forest Creek podcast. What were we just watching?
Ash vs. Evil Dead.
Have you seen this show before?
Yes, I have.
We just picked it up at the top of season 2, the continuation of the story. A story that has continued in fiction for, decades. It was probably, when was it the first one made? Like back in the 80s?
Yeah, I think it was a long time ago, but that was Sam Raimi's first film. I think it was his first film.
It was like his debut.
It was his debut film, and he made like a cheap, like a $10,000 or like less than $10,000 horror film.
Takes place in a cabin. Yeah. It's very...
Yeah, exactly. And it was a cult classic, and then obviously he went on to direct Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3, and then a bunch of other films, but...
Before that, he actually got to do sequels to this cult classic. He did an Evil Dead 2 and 3, and I think 3, okay, I kind of mentioned this while we were watching the TV show, but in 3, he literally the main character gets teleported back to the Middle Ages to fight evil yet again. Yeah, we're talking like in the Beowulf times. Real old Middle Ages, and there's like dark sorcerers and armies of skeletons. It's very D&D.
I love it.
There has been video games made about this. Yeah, kind of like a cult classic story. Ash versus the Evil Dead. The Evil Dead series kind of revolves around this, it all revolves around this book called the Necronomicon that turns people into scary monsters.
Well, doesn't it summons the dead? I thought that was the whole thing, right? Basically, you summon those spirits and then they kind of like take over people.
So, fun fact, the Necronomicon isn't actually a Sam Raimi invention. It's a Lovecraft invention.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, Lovecraft used to write about one of his many stories alongside Cthulhu and all these other kind of primordial evils is the Necronomicon, which has... part of its origin is that it's like passed down through ancient kingdoms. It's like written in ancient Samaritan or something, and then it's introduced into the story by an embodiment of Nyarlathotep, who's one of the monsters aforementioned. Mm-hmm. And then wherever it goes, it kind of, it's this book of evil spells and stuff. It'll probably, the only upside I can imagine is that maybe it gives you immortality or something, but like at a horrible, horrible price. Because you sell your soul to the elder gods.
You become this grotesque creature that's just wandering.
I guess in their case, yes. What did you guys think of Ash versus the Evil Dead, though?
Well, we actually saw the first season.
Right.
Mercedes, this was your first time watching it, and we started in the second season.
It actually brought me back to childhood. My dad would find the most B-rated movies ever. And we'd watch them all, and this is, definitely brought me back. Yeah, the gore in it surprisingly didn't bother me.
And there's a lot of gore.
There was a lot of gore. The worst part was
to put it short,
the morgue scene.
I mean, the main character, Ash, in one of the movies, I think the first one, part of his heroic arc is that his hand gets possessed by the same force that's possessing all his friends. Yeah. So he has to cut it off with a chainsaw before it takes him over, and then to fight back against them, he
took Jesus' words literally. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off.
Yeah, right?
And replace it with the chainsaw. That part wasn't in there, but...
I mean, it's definitely pretty thematic, I think, to literally do that.
Yeah.
And then he puts the chainsaw where the stump is, and that becomes like his, weapon of choice. Yeah.
That's what he's known
like
for.
Like Thor's hammer.
That and the boomstick, the shotgun. It's those two elements, those two weapons, It's
awesome. It's such a genre-based
yes.
TV show. It's so meta, and it knows its audience, and it does a few things, but it does those few things very, very well.
Yeah, he's like that fumbling savior that keeps messing up, but somehow in his mistakes, he's saving the world.
That's right.
Yeah, so the basic arc we picked it up on, Ash's, this Necronomicon keeps tumbling in and out of his life, and every time it gets close to him, it brings back the dead and causes everything to go terrible, and he's like a destined action hero that has to fight his way through. He's literally a chosen one in this kind of story, but he's always the one who's destined to run into this problem, and he's always, you know, humanity's savior, despite not really having any...
Yeah, he's sort of like he's the goofy savior. He's
did the Necronomicon like prophesy that he was the only one that could save them?
Yeah, he is kind of a chosen one. He does appear... I think that kind of comes to light in the third movie, you know, the one where he does go, you know, it's Middle Ages times, you know. Yeah, so the prophecy I think does pick up around there. And he is, in this kind of story, the destined main character. He even wears this shirt all the time, that blue shirt that's like, that's player one blue right there. And we kind of came across this thing that he is kind of like a tragic hero in a lot of ways. You just, the whole time you're watching him, he's being beat down on by dead people the whole time.
Yeah, well, he's actually not just beat down by the dead, but he's also beat down by the living. The living people, like we see that scene where...
Right.
Asher Slasher.
Yeah,
Ashy
Slashy.
yeah.
Ashy Slashy, right? He sees his old town, he meets his dad. His dad doesn't have the greatest relationship with his dad. They kind of have some funny moments, but clearly they're not in great terms. His dad kind of beats on him. And then he goes to a pub because he's looking for this woman who I guess has the Necronomicon or would know where it is. Yeah, so he goes to the pub where he looks for this woman, Ruby, who would know where the Necronomicon is. And then when he gets to that pub, he sees like all his old, I guess, classmates from high school, and they start beating down on him as well.
And then the nerdy guy won the dream girl. The sheriff.
Oh yeah. And the sheriff, the Chad sheriff who sucked in high school and still sucks now, but he pretends like he doesn't suck because he's a sheriff.
Well, I think in this situation, Ash is the Chad, and then he would be the virgin. I don't know if you've ever seen those memes where it's like literally a diagram, and you have like one beefcake looking dude on one side who's the Chad, and then you have this other poor posture walking dude, not even facing the camera, the virgin. And you just attach whatever you want to these situations. I mean, there's like a million comparison memes. But that is an interesting quality about Ash's character altogether, is that he's kind of like this high school quarterback kind of energy, where he's the charismatic guy who had a great past, and then now he's showing up after his life was ruined by all this stuff, and he's having to put up with the kind of being a reluctant hero.
Yeah.
I feel like it's interesting when you look at the relationship between the dad and Ash.
Right.
I feel like he maybe in his heart probably always wanted to be that hero, but his dad is the ultimate Chad, so he had to live up to that. And even it sounded like his dad would even take some of the girls that he was with and be with them, so he had to live up to this like persona living in the shadow of his dad. But ultimately I think he probably wanted to take on a hero role, but now he does it in this weird fumbling way of trying to juggle two personalities together.
Beginning of season 2, we meet Ash's dad, Ash Williams' father, Brock Williams, or as he introduces himself, Cock Williams. Yeah, it does. The whole series, I think, does take on this kind of like raunchy college kind of sense of humor.
He had that sticker on his truck where it's like, Brock's got wood, call me.
Yeah. Actual wood salesman. That's like, I guess there is something to do with his dad in the sense that like, who's the role model kind of influence? And then his dad turning his back on him despite kind of clearly being the force that informed a lot of his character.
Yeah.
Growing up. And that's an interesting thing to come to terms with, is like these two guys who are not that different, but they're, so at odds. You'd think that they would get along, right?
Yeah, it's definitely that classic case of like when you see father and son or two people, they're arguing the exact same thing with as much passion as the other, but they're totally going over each other's heads. And it was interesting to see like they're both trying to play the victim in their story, but they're both basically saying the same thing.
It's one of the areas where I really appreciate the casting of the show. I mean, Bruce Campbell has always played Ash. I think there was just the one reboot kind of attempt at making the serious horror version of this, and I think they gender swapped the character. I wasn't paying that much attention, but it was pretty decent.
I'll watch pretty much anything with Bruce Campbell in it. He's awesome.
The reboot doesn't have Bruce Campbell in it.
Well,
but this show does, which is part of what makes it so great.
Oh, I can't imagine this show without him. It would just fall apart. Like it's Ash versus the Evil Dead. Like if you don't have Ash, which is Bruce Campbell is Ash, then there is no Ash versus Evil Dead.
Like even from the movies, there was actually a little run in Marvel Comics where the Necronomicon fell into the Marvel universe, and then it turned everybody there into Deadites. I think he kind of fit in a wide variety of scenarios. Bruce Campbell really nails that character without that kind of...
What would you say is your favorite aspect of this show, Ash vs. Evil Dead? Because you've actually watched the whole thing. I haven't.
Yes.
I really like it. I've seen all the first season, and we just watched the beginning of the second season, but you've obviously watched the beginning to end. What's your favorite thing?
The important element in a show like this is it fun? And this is undeniably fun. It's really goofy.
Yeah.
It goes over the top a lot.
Yeah.
It's not always a straight shooter with the plot, but it's a ton of fun. And what helps with that is that it doesn't take itself too seriously.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's one of those where you don't mind kind of binging it a little. You're just like, oh, one more episode, that's not too bad. And then you're 3 episodes deep.
Well, we're 2, so...
We could have kept going, but we had to record this podcast, everybody. Oh.
Well, I gotta get it out in time for Halloween, which is really the impetus of all this. We came on to Netflix and we're like, what are we gonna go for? What's gonna be the Halloween flick? It was either Halloween itself, which we don't have the most recent ones, or it was His House, which I was a big fan of wanting to watch.
But I am a wimp, I will admit.
Because you live in a house.
I wanted to watch The Invisible Man. That's what I wanted.
I felt like I knew it already. Like, do I have to see this? What's it really gonna?
Know it, but you don't know it.
Do you know it?
No.
Right. So why are you so confident?
Well, I've heard really, really good things. Like it has like an 8 point something on IMDb, and
yeah. But when you watch the trailer,
it's just a trailer, man.
They show you everything.
The movie.
They just tell you the whole plot.
You think they tell you the whole plot?
They more or less show me the entire movie in sequence.
That's generally why I don't watch trailers. If I'm gonna go into a show, I'm gonna go in blind and like full force.
I only watch trailers in one place, and that's in the movie theater before the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
And that happened to be one of them, and I was like, oh, I saw the whole thing and I saw it in theaters. I got my experience. I'm done. I watched every beat. I was like, okay. She has an abusive whatever. He figures out how to be invisible. He dies in an accident of some kind. Oh no, he's not actually dead because he's invisible and he's taunting her. And he makes her life hell. And then at one point it gets over the top and she figures it out, and now he's going to have to kill her. Oh, obviously, she figures out a way to fight back, kills the Invisible Man, end of story, roll credits. Got it. I don't need to watch it.
Did you write the script?
Did I get it wrong? I haven't seen it, but feel free to tell me in the comments if I'm wrong.
If only we had people commenting.
It'll probably be me. I'll watch it after this and be like, I was right.
So, Halloween.
Right.
How do we feel about Halloween?
You want to talk about movies that have gone on for too long?
What?
Well, Halloween. There's so many of those.
Oh, gosh.
They've rebooted that movie series like 7 times.
It's a classic.
Yeah, but some things need to die. Like,
yeah. It's never...
Die with grace. Don't die when people are like, please, just be over.
Not everything is Breaking Bad, okay? Some things need to be milked because there's money to be made, okay? That's how these things work.
But Halloween, we were going to watch that. I was wanting to watch it. If Halloween ends...
you rented it, didn't you?
No.
Okay.
I tried to. But Halloween Ends is the one that just came out recently. Apparently, the most recent reboot is just going to be a 2-parter where Michael Myers breaks out of the insane asylum yet again, And then this time, though, when he goes after his old victims, the last survivor of it, this woman he's been chasing the whole time has become a hardcore grandma who sets up booby traps in her yard and has a shotgun and is therefore too tough and main character-y to kill.
Oh my god.
And
that'll be me one day.
she like lights him on fire or something in a house at the end of it. And
this has like the Halloween version of Home Alone, except for grandma.
Oh no, it's exactly that. That's quite it, but she does it with like guerrilla warfare. This is the second part of it. Halloween ends, and supposedly one of the big plot lines in it is that Michael Myers has like a protege at some point.
Isn't it his granddaughter or?
I'm not sure, because I heard it was just some random kid and completely different takes on, because the studio just looks around and goes, what IPs do we have? What can we make money off of? Oh, that one's been a number of years. We can renew that.
I mean, that's pretty well how it happens.
Yeah. It's like, hey, it's Halloween. October's coming. We need something to release. Start shooting it.
I hate when they do that with series. It's like Shrek. Like after the second, maybe the third one, they should have just ended. Yeah, the second one is gold. The third one, pretty debatable. After that, they should have just killed it off. Like, they ruined it.
Well, I mean, same thing, right? It goes, hang on, do you think Mike Myers is willing to do another one of these? Let's talk to the agents. The agents go, yeah, we're good. Call Cameron Diaz.
I've actually never seen Halloween.
I saw it a long time ago. We watched all of the horror movies as a child, and then we stopped watching them as adults.
I would sit through a marathon of the Halloween movies when I was a kid.
My family was completely opposite. We were like very, very traditional Catholics, except for Halloween. We spent like 2 weeks just preparing everything. My dad's favorite holiday is Halloween. So we'd dress up, we'd decorate the house, we'd make it all scary. Anyone who walked to the door, we'd scare the crap out of them, like these little kids, and like shower candy on them. How would you scare the kids? Well, my brother, we took the actual like dangerous part off of a chainsaw. So he'd run after them with a chainsaw, except for it wouldn't be like fully active, but you'd still hear the sound of it. But yeah, we went pretty all out every year. Oh, we'd watch all the low budget films. Like, have you watched Sharknado? That was a classic.
Okay, that's not even B-roll. That's like, that's like Z-roll.
What's the scariest movie you think you've ever seen?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. You know, one movie that really effed me up as a kid, and I watched it as an adult. It's not even scary, but it was one of those really old black and white classic vampire movies. The vampire was coming at the window and knocking on the window and like trying to capture this girl. For literal years, I could not look out my window at night because I was terrified. I'd put a blanket over it, or I'd like just cover myself and pray that I wouldn't be taken by a vampire. And honestly, I was thinking about that before we watched this film, because you wanted to watch the scariest movie on Netflix.
His House. I still need to watch it.
Out of all the most terrifying movies they've made, that one immediately came to my mind. I was like, yeah, that effed me up for years.
I think it's probably Insidious for me.
For you?
I haven't seen that many, but I remember watching Insidious with Josh and being like, this is actually pretty creepy. There was like the final sequence. I didn't even like, I was like not even fully watching it. And I think they made an Insidious 2. I think the rest of the Insidious films, I think maybe the third was better and they kind of came back to form. But I heard the second one was not very good. But I watched the first one with Josh and I remember that actually being very scary.
I have a hard time thinking of what is the scariest thing I've ever watched. It's probably, I think the one that shook me up the most as a kid was I hated Chucky.
Oh yeah,
I hated it so much.
I watched that when I was like little, like 6 years old.
Well, there's
frick.
I would run to my mom. We were watching in the living room, and I'd run out to my mom. And she was crying. I was like, "Mom, the doll, it came alive." And my dad was like, "It's fine, just leave it." We hear him yelling from the living room. So I'd be watching it around the corner, just like with a blanket near my eyes. And we were small, like we we watched like Kill Bill, like all of the scary things as like little kids. So like the gore and all that stuff didn't bother me at all. It's more of the psychological stuff that will freak me out because my imagination goes wild. But
Dude,
any of the gore, it's just like, oh, that's fine.
I could not play with action figures or dolls of any kind, nothing with a face. My toy of choice as a kid after those movies was Lego. I could not mess with any of that other stuff.
Those yellow figurines didn't scare you too?
No.
Those little boxy legs, they're not creeping you out?
They don't resemble humans enough that I can kind of dissociate a little bit.
So, I mean, I find that it's interesting because there's different types of horrors. You got like the gory, kind of the slapstick, which is more evil, you know, Ash versus Evil Dead. But then you have the more like the psychological horror, kind of more on the celestial realm where there's like spirits or like you don't see.
It's not just that.
I
have an honorable mention here.
Yeah.
There's so many people who have come to have a complete phobia of birds after seeing Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds.
Birdemic.
No, not Birdemic. Good one. Where it's like, you know, this old town and something weird's happening where a literal cloud of birds will just attack people.
Oh,
at random and they'll
my friend,
die.
when I was little, she could not stand birds. She would literally have a panic attack if there was more than 3.
It happened to one of my coworkers, and it happened to my sister, who to this day is terrified of birds.
Did you watch it?
Yeah. Ever since we saw that movie.
Yeah, I haven't. I actually love birds. I love sparrows in particular, but yeah, I feel like that movie would probably mess me up for a while because you always know if you see 3 like crows or ravens together, like, you know, something bad's gonna happen, like this ominous sign. Sometimes that will still get me, but yeah, I could understand it after watching a movie like that.
I think there's this thing to horror that like you can make anything scary.
Yeah.
But we tend to opt towards the things that we understand as being dangerous. Right.
Well, but some things get flipped on their heads. For example, clowns. They're supposed to make you laugh and be silly.
Stop. The first clown was an alcoholic who beat his family.
Well, when you put it like that.
They're not all bad. They're all bad. It is a psychopath who puts on fun colors and pretends to entertain children.
I am actually very curious. Who would, like, where did clowns come from? Like, what is the invention of the clown?
Well, they're like gestures, you know, medieval areas.
So it's like mimes?
No, it's not mimes.
Well, it's performance art, right? So some people train
like, where did the
in
red
performance
nose
art.
come from?
Well,
the big
it would
goofy
probably, because,
shoes,
you know,
the white paint, the crazy red afro that's also balding. It's just
if you
creepy.
studied any medieval text, they would have these gestures in the court with the king, and they were specifically just to make the king and like the
You're
court
conflating
laugh.
Comedian with clown.
No, but it's
The
not.
jester-
It's not quite a comedian.
A jester in that context was a comedian.
But he wore the whole getup. So if you mix the both together, then because they would have those hats and they'd have balls on the end of those silly hats. Then you take that, put it on the nose, and you create these like, because they would have the pointy, like curved shoes, kind of like an elf almost, and just have these kind of
like the
theatrical outfits.
So basically, entertain the king. Find a way to entertain the. Is that the kind
of?
of?
Yeah, entertain the king in the courts. So you'd have these gestures.
And if you fail to entertain him, you get killed.
You'd literally get like beheaded, or you would literally lose your life if the king did not find you funny and he was more of a tyrannical king.
Holy cow.
You would actually die. So you really had to, like, this job was serious, and you had like these whole performative outfits. But I think as time went on and maybe it got less tyrannical, kind of an amalgamation of both happened.
Have either of you ever read King Lear? Seen it? Yes. There's a fool in that, and he plays like this excellent mirror to King Lear because he's always saying things that are true.
Yeah, the holy fool, basically.
Yeah, in some way.
So this makes perfect sense. It's all coming together. The kings would kill the unfunny fools, and those unfunny fools became clowns, and now that's why they're in horrors, because they're basically seeking vengeance for how poorly they were treated in the past.
Well, at some point it just kind of became, hey, that's the guy who makes us laugh by being an idiot at the circus. Not
Pure
making
horror.
balloons.
So
making balloons in front of your children.
It is really just a classic revenge flick.
Well, Stephen King's It is like Pennywise the clown is like one face of it, right? Because the whole point of it in that kind of series is that it embodies whatever you fear most.
Right.
And for
right.
Georgie, it was the clown.
Like a Bogart from Harry Potter.
Hiya, Georgie. It's a way.
Have you seen the remake?
No.
Oh, the remake's really well done. Really, really well done.
Yeah,
actually.
at least the first one.
I didn't see the second, so I have no idea. But I remember watching the first one in theaters, and it was scary, but like honestly, it was a good time. It was like it was like a roller coaster or something. That's kind of how I thought about it.
Yeah, definitely one of the better movies. I'm hearing that currently the best movie in horror out there right now is Smile.
What's that one?
I've not seen.
People say that it is genuinely terrifying, but it seems to be about some kind of possession disease kind of thing where people are suddenly just sitting there smiling and then they do or say something weird that then infects whoever saw them do it, that those people end up smiling.
That
and
would
then
freak
doing the
me
same
out.
thing.
If someone's just sitting there smiling at me, I don't even like when people do it on the best of days, but if they smile and side glance you, that shit would freak me up. I'd be terrified.
Well, I mean,
Is this why you don't like cats?
I don't. I'll be
The
honest.
cats can't smile.
You know,
unless they're a Cheshire cat,
yeah.
although that is kind of a rare scenario.
So maybe instead of the birds,
The critics
you'd
were
have the cats.
saying about this movie that they were like afraid to smile walking out of the theater or something. I mean,
Oh, so that okay. I can
it's said to
kinda
be a pretty,
connect the dots here and see what the
Scary
film might
movie.
be about.
but that's a good example of like turning something up on its head, right? In the same way that the clown was, you could do it with a smile, you could do it with birds.
Well, I think that's what makes it so creepy. Is it something, especially for example, clowns are smiling. It's something that should be innocent and pure and a source of like comfort and warmth. And the most terrifying thing is when something that should be innocent becomes evil, and it distorts reality. So you get confused as like, is this something that I can trust because it's smiling at me, or is it actually evil? Is it gonna be deceitful and harm me? And I think that psychological twist of reality is what makes things so terrifying, because there's a confusion that you can't quite navigate, so you're always tiptoeing and you're like, okay, is this gonna harm me or help me? And I think sometimes the most terrifying things is in that cloud of confusion.
Well, that's the thing. It's like what I find with horror films, and most horror directors do this, is like the monster is obscured, and they kind of keep the monster obscured, and it's the anticipation that's the most fearful thing. And then once you actually see the monster, it's like scary for a minute, but then you kind of get used to it.
Well,
and then it doesn't
because
have the
you
same
can
effect
know
anymore.
how to confront it. If you can see what you're dealing with, your mind immediately looks at all the aspects, judges it, and it's like, okay, what do I have to confront this? But if it's always kept in the shadows, you don't know what you're dealing with, so you don't know what tools or strengths you can use to defeat it. And that's...
So are you making the argument that the more obscure the monster is, the scarier it is?
Well, yeah, because you can see that even in your own life, even in like simple things. If you don't have a certain goal that you're working towards, or your life is just in this cloud, it becomes very oppressive, and you know, people get so weighed down that, you know, you get depressed and you turn to very like drastic measures. But if you can see what you're coming up against, and it's not obscured, then you have a better idea, or you can at least plan your attack. But when you can't, then you're left in, you don't know what way's up, what way's down, where you're going, and it becomes, you're just like thrashing around trying to defeat this thing. And
So-
that's where terror kind of comes in.
If we look at like there's this sort of a symbolism going on with horror, where almost always horror tends to have the villain or the horrifying thing is like wearing a mask, or it's like in Paranormal Activity, you don't see it. You see the effects, but you don't actually see the thing. Insidious
you don't
was,
know when it's coming.
yeah, and then sometimes they have a payoff at the end where you finally see it, and that's kind of the peak, and then eventually it chills out because, and I think most of these horror writers they intuitively understand, or they're probably not even intuitively, they fully understand the fact that they kind of suggest the monster throughout, and then eventually they know once they unveil it, it's like a peak, and then they're not going to be able to kind of maintain that same fear,
Well, I think because the most suspenseful
the
thing is your mind. Like when your thoughts
your
go,
imagination's way more terrifying.
Exactly, which is why a lot of times when you watch a scary movie, yeah, you're scared in the moment, but you're fine afterwards, especially with your buddies. And then when you are alone, your anxiety and your mind start creating these wild scenarios and you're terrified. You can't sleep. You need to sleep with the lights on. It's too much for you to handle because it's really your imagination and like your anxiety mixed with that create this terror state. And when you can't see things but you feel like they're there, yeah, I feel like that is probably the most terrifying. I think people in general can handle gory things. Like I don't think that's really what terrifies people.
We just tend to pair it with horror in general.
Well, because preceding the gore comes the suspense, and you're like waiting. You're like, holy cow, like what's gonna happen? And then like some kind of like slasher thing or some gory scene happens.
So would you say then, because it seems like we're circling this idea that fear is generated by uncertainty, like not knowing.
I think that's a pretty accurate assessment.
I would agree, and actually that kind of ties back a little bit to Lovecraft because his big thing was xenophobia, right? I'm actually reading one of his stories right now. It's called The Nameless City, and it's just about this traveler who comes across a city in the desert that's like spoken of by crazy people alone, and that people like don't dare to know it. And he finds that it's because this city is older than humans are, and that it was inhabited by some weird, crazy primordial race that was like beyond any concept now, and it's starting to freak him out, bend his mind a little bit, so he's trying to get out of the temple. I'm not all the way through it yet, but
that plays into the fear and uncertainty because it's not conforming with the reality that he knows. If you look at most people, the ones that are actually terrified are the ones with the most uncertainty, when they feel like the ground is like slipping under them. And then they take control in all these kind of crazy ways, but it's literally driven by fear. It's a fear-based approach to almost everything, and that's why you're like, man, that person's so controlling, or their anger so explosive, or all of that. It's because they're trying to take as much control as possible because they're afraid. And then you see that even in horror films, or even people watching horror films. A lot of times I find the most amusing people, and I'm guilty of it, is when they're so scared watching a horror movie that they just keep talking. They'll talk, or they'll laugh, or they'll somehow distract, because that's their way of taking control of the situation. So they're like, okay, if I have this little bit of control, then I won't be as afraid because I can talk through it and I know what's going on. And I laugh at those people, but I've also been one of those, definitely, just to talk through or laugh through a film. It's total cope. It's copium.
Copium.
it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's like now that's uncertainty from the other way around. It's the monster that's uncertain at some point. It's not just the victim, and wanting that control. Isn't that the thing that would drive serial killers? Like, what the most popular things on Netflix in the past while have been like Ted Bundy, played by Zac Efron, which we made a sketch about. Be up soon. And Jeffrey Dahmer is the new one. And they kind of almost make, from what I've heard, Jeffrey Dahmer to be like the hero of the series in some way, despite being the serial killer.
What do you think is the cause of this fascination with these, serial killers?
We should ask her, because apparently girls are way more into true crime.
I will admit, I am.
Wow, I called it.
I cannot deny. Well, for me, it's more of trying to understand how a mind would work that would be capable of such evil things. And in one sense, it goes back to what we're talking about of taking control, of even intellectually trying to piece it together and puzzle it. And it's one of those things when you're talking about such horrific crimes, it's something that is illogical. That is a fact, but people, they generally don't like that as an answer, because if it's illogical and it's chaotic, then it could be at random and you cannot make sense of it, which means you could be the victim of it. But if you try and piece it together and you're like, okay, let's work out this mind, let's work out what victims they were looking at, all these types of things, in one sense, in a very obscured way. And I don't think most people are on the surface blatantly thinking of it, but behind the scenes, it's like, how do I not become a person that fits into that victim kind of box where they could be attacked?
Right.
And
So the attractive part of watching one of these serial killer flicks is that you get to psychoanalyze the situation.
And
Right.
and I've watched like quite a few, but sometimes like I like watching people watch things because I like analyzing the people who watch, you know, these serial killers. And like, well, why are you interested in this? And it comes down to this psychoanalyzing and like really trying to piece it apart. Whenever you see fear, most often on the flip side, you'll see someone who's overly controlling. But that's motivated by a fear-based approach, but it doesn't look like that on the surface. And you'll see these people like breaking down all of these aspects, psychoanalyzing things, or like we said, explosive anger, or becoming like these really like top people. But it's a lot of times it's driven by like an insecurity and a fear.
That's a fascinating rationale. A couple weeks ago, I read a little clickbait article. Jeffrey Dahmer's dad giving an interview talking about how ever since this Netflix show came out, women have been showing up and yelling at his house and throwing their panties on his lawn.
Oh my gosh.
Because of how thrilled they are, apparently, with it. I mean, there's also...
What is the cause of that? That seems totally different.
Here's my pitch. You start psychoanalyzing, and then you get too close to the material, and then you romanticize it.
Yeah,
and
that happens.
That's why actual people on death row love letters.
Yeah.
Lots of
my
them.
gosh, they have incredible fangirls. They have like hundreds of letters sent to them in these like fangirling, weird sexualized fantasies. That's true. If you psychoanalyze too much and if you don't have boundaries with compassion towards people, you cross that threshold and then you start justifying things, or you're like, oh, it's not that bad, or then you really start to romanticize things, and you get some like really psycho people who, they write these like really like grotesque sexualized fantasy love letters to these serial killers.
Just the serial killer in jail. You think I'm sick? Look at this.
Yeah, well, there's this one horrific serial killer in Japan, and this guy would get, and he was a serial rapist killer.
He was a cannibal.
And a cannibal. He literally ate his victims.
That's the whole point.
And he actually...
Was that Dahmer? Dahmer did that a little bit?
I don't know.
I think so.
Just a little bit of eating.
But he didn't even get the death penalty.
That's because his rich dad saved him.
Yeah, but he ended up getting some disability and some tragic thing. But he basically, lived out his days. But people still write him all these love letters internationally. So that's something. Yeah, we talk about the psychoanalytical aspect, but then what happens when you cross that boundary? You romanticize it, and then you get into these really disturbing sexualized fantasies. Like, what is that?
So hold on, what is the romanticizing going on here? Like, is it the fact that like, oh, they're dying, and so you're kind of going overboard with the compassion here, and maybe you see this?
No,
like,
it's not
romantic...
a compassion of them dying. Like, you're talking about the serial killer dying.
Well, I'm trying to understand, like, where does how do you romanticize that?
Well, if we take a few steps back, when you look at a case of someone who's in a very like domestic violence. They have this trauma bond there. And a lot of times, even though you know abuse is going on, you've connected yourself emotionally and a lot of times physically in these trauma situations. And it creates this weird kind of distortion in your brain of love and hurt are together, especially a lot of times that comes from childhood wounds. Like if your parents have been very like harmful and traumatizing, but they're also your source of love, you combine both of those, and that's your understanding. Love comes with hurt, and then you get these weird trauma bonds, and then people sexualize that, and then you get these really disturbing cases.
Well, but like that would make perfect sense though, because if sex is a manifestation of love, it's sort of like a making
well, it's one
love,
of the ultimate
right?
forms of expression of love.
Yeah, it's an expression of love, like in the body so that would make sense that if you've already made that association of like hurt with love, then obviously when you make love, then the pain has to be involved somehow, right? So that's, I guess that
sometimes
would explain
like
some of the fetishes and things like that.
Yeah, well, you and not everyone who gets into like the BDSM world is part of this, although I do suspect a lot of them have a lot of these types of you know, wounds and stuff. But yeah, I don't think you would find people fetishizing or romanticizing people like this without some past history of like trauma mixed with love and like entering into this like trauma bond world. For me, I do like studying sometimes these like serial killers or stuff like that, just to figure out how their mind works and what gets to that point. And that's more of like an intellectual approach. And I think like for me, it could go back to people distorting my worldview of like what reality actually is, gas kind of lighting approach. So mine's more intellectual, but if you've been sexually manipulated in any way, I think a lot of times you'll get more people who look at these horrific people and they're like, oh wow, like you're this villainous hero in my world. Like they still understand that they're a villain.
So does the trauma bonding kind of create like a Stockholm syndrome?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right.
It does.
Do you think that's happening like on a much wider scale with all these people suddenly looking at, hey, that's Zac Efron as Ted Bundy?
Of course it is, because look at these movies that are coming out. What was that? Like I don't think it's quite in that realm, but like 50 Shades of Grey and like all these novels. Women in particular are much more novel based. Because it's more like the imagination mind based rather than like, I think guys are much more into like pornography because it's very visual.
I feel like we've eroded some attention spans.
Yeah.
I don't know if people are. I don't know if as many people are reading anymore.
Well, no, but women, it is quite. Oh my gosh, it's pretty messed up because I just stumbled upon.
If you want to hear something scary, is Dr. Phil on Rogan today was like 19% of people graduating high school in the U.S. can't read.
19%.
Oh my
I don't think his numbers are right at all, but
well, it could be. Well, I'm kind of entering into this
here's
world.
an interesting question, because part of that uncertainty building, part of that extending that period in a horror movie, for instance, where you're trying to build that trauma, as we'll say, there's these long pulls, there's a lot of waiting that goes on to help create that uncertainty. But if people's attention spans are continuing to erode, continuing to lessen, is there a way to do quick horror?
Probably. I mean, look at these children films that are coming out. They're like 5-second intervals in between a change of scene. And I think probably the horror films, they're cutting things shorter and shorter. There's suspenseful jump scare. Then like all these action films, it's one thing after another, not a whole lot of plot building or character arcs or things like that. Yeah, I'm entering into this world of seeing the education side, like actually in the schools, and their attention base is very minimal. Very minimal. So I could definitely see horror film progressing into very like quick, short.
Well, hold on. Sorry, just to answer your question, 100% I think it can. If you've ever had a thought, just a singular thought, and at the immediate, as soon as you think of that thought, you're horrified. It doesn't take a lot, right? And so you won't be able to develop suspense. I think suspense does require more time, right? So that's why, like in a film, you kind of have this, it's a longer medium. You have like an hour and a half to 2 hours or more to build the suspense. In a short format, like on Facebook or YouTube, you have these little shorts, or Instagram, or whatever. It'd be hard to develop suspense, but you could definitely have horror.
Well, have either of you met someone with pretty high generalized anxiety? Like, they'll get terrified.
It's like a knife. The thought hits them like a knife.
Well, yeah, and they could be sitting there completely calm, and one thought will send them into a panic attack.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, though, is the more like studies that come out, so many more kids, children, teenagers have high anxiety. So little things will set them off, like completely set them off into like a total meltdown, or they'll just be like total shutdown or explosive behavior. But it's more and more, and I think, like you said, with these different like YouTube shorts or all these different very quick things.
I'm sold. What kind of monster do we capitalize off of this with? Let's make one.
That's actually interesting. What monster? Because I think people with more stability can handle the suspense, and you can drag it out, and it really gets
Here's my
them.
pitch. I think there's another side to horror besides the uncertainty, and that's the actual punchline of it itself. The jump scare, the here's the monster, here's the reveal.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's supplemented by something we already know is scary. We know a tiger's jaws are terrifying. We know the feeling of walking through a spider web is horrible. We are already horrified by gore and like things that make us queasy. Maybe there is something of just like, how do we just make this thing as terrifying as possible and just jump it at people at the right moment?
Well, now we're like building and building. It's almost like that dopamine effect where you have to give like something bigger and better.
That's true. But then you walk it back to like something very plain, like a smile.
Yeah.
Like,
I think Ash is the answer to how to address your fears. I think is in a strange way, it's actually quite profound. Because when we look at Ash, right, so he's like facing all these like
you mean
gory
the Evil Dead
Ash
series
versus, like we started
yeah.
this whole thing talking about Ash versus Evil Dead, but I actually, now that I think about it, his response to these horrifying things is like the best response ever. He keeps his wits. He doesn't take himself super seriously, and he understands that he has a duty, and nothing's gonna get in the way of him accomplishing that goal, right? He's like, I'm here to stop you guys. And even though, like any other normal human being, and it's funny because Pablo in the first season, he has this amazing scream. He's still a scaredy cat in the second season, but he has just this incredible girl scream that he does. Ash never really screams like that. He just kind of looks at it like weirded out. He's like, this is weird.
Because
this
he's
is gross. And
Chad. He's a Bruce Campbell.
Exactly. He's a total Chad. He's like, and then he just cracks the thing in the face with this with his fist.
Or his chainsaw.
So it is the answer to fear. Be like Ash.
Just be a Chad. That's the whole deal right there. His character, like we were talking about before, fascinates me in the sense that he's like had all the glory of being like a hero when he was young, and then this cabin incident happens where he goes ashy slashy and it ruins his life. And ever from there on, he actually has to be a hero, but that's a life of pain and everybody hates you. And you constantly have to deal with literally hell.
Right? Yeah.
To do it for like no glory at all.
So like in a very strange analogy, a Christ-like figure. Where like
but it's Bruce Campbell.
It's Bruce Campbell, yeah. And it's just so funny because he's literally covered in shit in this episode. Like he fights a colon. He fights a small intestine and a colon.
By far the most disgusting episode of the show.
and the colon's got teeth at the end of it, and it's trying to bite him, and then all of a sudden it tries to bite him, and it bites the gun, and what was his catchline?
And it's like crawling down, like he's literally crawling up its asshole.
This town isn't big enough for 2 assholes. The only asshole it is gonna be me.
And boom, he blows it up, and the crap goes everywhere, especially all over it.
Yeah,
It's brilliant.
That show does a really great job at like taking horror themes and taking horror scenes and styles and then applying it to something like this. But the payoff in it, instead of it being a jump scare, it's like this comedy action routine.
Yeah.
In some way where he has to haphazardly kind of Jackie Chan his way through the grossest situations.
I don't want to travel.
So I guess is that the real answer to horror is to endure pain?
Yeah, endure pain. Don't take yourself too seriously. I think the more serious you
Don't
take yourself,
fall in love while you psychoanalyze serial killers.
Oh, God.
have your boundaries. Well, that happens, like you see in so many of these like silly horror film or like thriller movies, when they get a moment when they're hiding from the monster, and it's like, you know, guy and girl alone, they're terrified, but they have that moment where they just look at each other. Boom, like some type of weird romantic switch is flipped. Whereas, like, but previous to that, you see a lot of times the girl is just totally not interested in the guy, or the guy's like, oh, like you're a total bimbo. But in that moment of fear and trauma where something's chasing after you, if you have a brief moment, you look at this person in a different light, and that romantic switch just goes off, and you're like, oh, I want to be with you.
There is this idea that the thing that pervades horror, the genre in general, is sin. The main character always has to do something wrong to bring this force in. If we look at, Ash, for instance, he's a jock. He kind of invited this on himself, or he and his friends did, because he's like in a cabin and they're just getting drunk and having a weekend, and then he brings up the Sumerian text and in his ignorance decides he's gonna try reading passages from it. But the same thing is true across the horror genre in general. It's always like the teens who are doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, bad kid stuff, and they invite evil.
Well, even if you go more classic than that, like Frankenstein, trying to have this
reanimate the dead.
Yeah.
That's another thing that gets flipped on its head, like we were talking about earlier, is that the dead rising is a great example of that. Because when you're told the dead are going to come back to life again, you're like, oh, my family member that I lost? Wow, that's wonderful. But they're going to have the same rotting corpse is a different idea. That they're going to want to eat your brain.
Yeah.
Like in classic zombie genres, or in this case, be completely possessed by demons like the Deadites are in the Evil Dead series. But it's interesting to look at.
Well, so that's an interesting point, because there's a book, I haven't read it, I've heard a talk on it. It's quite interesting. It's called Monsters of the Id. And this author basically looks at the history of horror, going all the way back with Shelley and Frankenstein, and he looks at the context and what the authors were experiencing when they started writing these things. And it's true. It's like, what was the particular fear at that time? And so, for example, he mentions how the slasher films that started coming out, they were actually because of STDs. Yeah,
wasn't
so,
like Dracula. Like syphilis?
Yeah, apparently Dracula's about syphilis.
Well, it's funny. I was gonna mention this earlier. One of the first people to play Dracula in film was Christopher Lee, the guy who played Saruman and Count Dooku.
Oh.
Later on.
Oh yeah. I think this is probably one of the vampire movies that I watched that actually did terrify me.
It was Christopher Lee. He played like the first Dracula.
I remember that. That's true.
And he was chosen because he was an opera actor, and he's like this tall, handsome guy that you just put a couple things in his teeth, and then he does the smile, and you're like, oh yeah, that's Dracula right there. That's like this charming, romantic character.
Yeah. It's interesting because he kind of notes how the sexual revolution that was going on at the time that, supposedly liberated all these people. And then, obviously STDs became a big thing, and the whole AIDS terror was happening. And so a lot of the horror films that were coming out, it's like these horrifying moments were typically happening when people were having sex. Right? So he talks about Alien.
Right.
Like Alien's a similar situation. And so like they even like give birth to the alien and stuff like that. It's like coming out of them. And then it's like, I think there's another scene Or it's yeah.
Last time we went to a cabin in the woods, we actually watched Cabin in the Woods.
And there's that scene. There's that scene in the woods where they actually, they start, and then
And that's the whole movie pretty much hinges on that idea that like
yeah.
it's the sacrifice of these sinful characters that is going to feed the elder gods, feed Lovecraft's elder gods, feed the Necronomicon, and sustain the whole deal.
So what is the fear for contemporary times? Do you think it's still the same as it was in the 70s? I feel like it's changed.
I think it's changed.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's changed.
Because like, what kind of horror films are coming? Like that Smile film. That Smile film might be touching on
You're
something.
gonna catch a smile like you catch COVID. Well, I don't think it's that simple. At least not now. I feel like there's just so much, because it's not as though the most popular things always have that basis, right? I think part of the slasher thing, right, is the latchkey kid, the thing that ended that latchkey kid generation, where these serial killers started popping up in the news, and suddenly you don't want to let your kids go out to play until sundown without like unsupervised, right? My 7th grade teacher was a cop, and he used to tell us all kinds of stories, and he was loosely attached to this case of a serial killer who was here in Canada, who used to kidnap kids and then hammer nails into their heads.
Wow.
Yeah. That's terrifying.
So you can imagine being a parent hearing that and be like, yeah, I think we're going to just keep an eye on them. We're going to keep them close.
In their
And
bubble.
in many ways, that's what kind of inspired the helicopter parenting era. But you're correct to some degree, and that can create things like Michael Myers. And I can even see how like the satanic panic kind of era.
Yeah, 100%.
Creates that same deal.
That kind of created a whole, a lot of films came out during that time. It's really fascinating because The Exorcist was
The old one?
Yeah,
Or
the original one, I believe. That film actually drove millions of people into the church. So many people were terrified after that film, and they converted. Which is interesting. But yeah, there was that... the satanic panic was a real event, and the films corresponding at that time, I think, let's say, capitalized on
what's
on those fears.
interesting is like at the time it might have created a fear where they didn't want to approach, but what I find now, like in our times now, is it almost drives people to more of a curiosity to dabble in it. So like
the Ouija boards and stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like they have a fear and they're like, oh, this is gonna like have some messed up shit happen. But they're like, ooh, I'm kind of curious.
There's something seductive going on.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. There definitely is something seductive there that's drawing them in, and their curiosity is like, I know this is probably gonna end poorly, but I'm curious. Like let's just dip our toe in, and then they enter into this whole...
And pretty soon they're just swimming in the lake. They're just splashing all throughout.
And then, because they do, the Loch Ness Monster has to eat them.
Cabin in the Woods is awesome. That's actually one of my favorite horror films. Because it's all of them.
It's a parody of horror films
It's all
inside of a horror
yeah,
movie, yeah. And it kind of explains that whole situation very well. I am forever partial to watching something Evil Dead related every Halloween now. At least recently, since high school. I was watching the show. I was watching like the movies here and there, something picking that up. When I was a kid, like I was saying earlier, I used to do that with the Halloween movies with Michael Myers, because they weren't that scary. They were just kind of like a thriller where a killer is chasing you, but like that was episodes of MacGyver or like that. Like occasionally, I did watch those old ones like the vampire movies.
Yeah,
with
we
Christopher
watched
Lee.
Vampires, werewolves. Like zombies weren't quite as much, but yeah, we were really into those as kids. What's interesting though is like I was just thinking about my time when I was watching Paranormal Activity with my brother, and like it's not that scary, but I do get scared with a lot of these films. But that film in particular, what happened with my brother and I is we almost chose not to be scared. So we made it into this like mocking kind of joke of a film.
You could watch it.
Yeah, and you created, and we were laughing, like we were in tears. We were laughing so hard during almost the entirety of this film, and especially at the moments that were meant to be the scariest. My brother and I were laughing the hardest. And it's interesting, like we talked about how some people get into this romanticized, like weird fantasy, but then there's some people that look at horror and they just, in one sense, shut down the part of themselves that should have that fight or flight response.
Like they dissociate from that.
Yeah, they dissociate and create this like comedy of it. And that's probably where you get some of these like comedy horror genres.
Well, sometimes that happens if it's bad. That's part of the reason why the first Evil Dead became that cult classic, is that it was a student film that didn't go so well, and because of that, it actually turned out to be great.
Yeah.
Well, but there is something to say when you look at something quite grim. For example, it's not quite horror, maybe for some it is, but at funerals, sometimes that's the time you kind of chuckle the most when you really shouldn't. But like, what is that when you are confronted with something either like scary or
some people
sad
like to
or
say
grim?
You're not dealing with your emotions because you're hiding in comedy, or you're not dealing with the serious thing, and then other people say that's a good, spirited way to approach grief, or in many cases horror.
Yeah, the not taking yourself too seriously aspect of what.
Yeah, which is what makes Ash versus the Evil Dead awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also at the same time not that scary, because they do have a lot of the sharp teeth and the dead looking things and the gore.
Yeah, it takes the edge off.
Yeah.
It takes the edge off, right? So Ash versus Evil Dead is like, it's gore with a big pint of beer. That's what that is.
Do you guys have a big Halloween plan? What do you plan to dress up as for Halloween? Are you gonna dress up?
I'll dress up as you, and you can dress up as me. We'll just swap clothes. And
already
we
have
can
a
show
costume.
up to Josh's party, and we'll have a good time.
Wait, what's your costume?
I'm the Grim Reaper.
Oh, come on.
That's my
You could
new
do
favorite
better.
thing. I love being the Grim Reaper.
Is that just gonna be you in a bathrobe and having a little staff?
Yes, sir. It's the perfect costume. It's so little effort. It's immediately recognizable. And I get to just chill in a bathrobe all Halloween while everybody else is in makeup.
Yeah, see, because of probably my upbringing, I can't do low effort for Halloween. It's either nothing or all out. And I think this year, I've been wanting to for a couple years, but I want to do some kind of like steampunk-esque kind of gear makeup. I used to do a lot of special effects makeup. I did a pop art zombie a couple years ago, but I've been having this one idea for a costume. I don't really do costumes. I do the makeup part, and the costume part suffers. It does.
Well, you do the makeup part well, and then you can afford to be a little bit lazy.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what happened. Like,
Right.
I was late, as I generally am, to things, and it was 5 minutes. Everyone had their votes in for the best costume. I walk in 5 minutes before they were gonna say it, and then unanimously they're like, "Oh, Mercedes has it for like the pop art zombie." But it's things like that I do enjoy. But yeah, it takes a lot of effort. 2-3 hours just doing your makeup. So you're like minimal effort. Mine's like probably maximum effort.
I did this really, really, really low effort one once where I printed out the warning label that goes on laser pointers. I put it on my back, and then I put a pie tin in front and a red Solo cup on my head. And I was a laser pointer.
That's awesome. Well, one year I was in college and I did this kind of Cleopatra, like fully gold. I actually put effort into my costume this time. And I came second place and probably should have won first place. But the person I went with, she went as Trump and like paint her face
hilarious.
orange and do the two-way thing. She won hands down, and I laughed so hard. Like it was this weird, like minimal effort, but just like perfectly orchestrated costume. And I wasn't even upset. She walked by and perfect impression, everything. I was like, yeah, I'd vote for you too. It was brilliant.
I mean, I think probably some of the most effort I've ever put into a costume. You can go on our YouTube, youtube.com/@therealforest creek. YouTube does handles now, and we couldn't get the Forest Creek. We had to get the real Forest Creek. There's some empty account that has it, no contact information.
Interesting.
I don't know. But if you go on to our YouTube channel, you can find a sketch of me in Murder Hornet costume. And I just got a yellow t-shirt, and I, did black tape around it to do the stripes, and then I did face paint and everything. And then Aiden helped me shoot it. Like, he was holding the camera the whole time I was doing it. And then afterwards, we're like, well, do you want to go to McDonald's? I was like, yeah, let's go to McDonald's. And I was most of the way to McDonald's with him. We were walking. I was like, Aiden, I feel like I'm wearing blackface. I'm not sure I can go into the McDonald's, but I did anyway.
I had a friend who literally did blackface, but her character was
What?
from Tropic Thunder.
I know who
Oh,
it
okay.
Names shall not be named. But
Yeah, that person would
Retard.
like lose their job now.
yeah, but she did it perfectly. Oh my gosh. It was it Robert Downey Jr.?
Yeah.
That is,
Who did that?
Oh
That's
my God, playing a
amazing.
black
That
dude.
movie was incredible. That's another thing people are worried about as a genre, is that no good comedies are made anymore.
Well, because everybody takes things
It's either
too personally.
You know,
or
but
Kevin Hart screaming,
This
or
is
The Rock, who can't lose and kind of does action films now anyway, or it's Seth Rogen. I don't know.
it's just the same thing over and over again. He's kind of, I'm not crazy, but like with the Robert Downey Jr., like Tropic Thunder is hilarious. It is a hilarious film. And there's so many wild and crazy characters throughout that entire movie. But like Robert Downey Jr., he was obviously hesitant about doing this
Yeah.
role. He asked his black friends, namely Jamie Foxx.
Yeah.
He's like, can I do this? And then he did his impression, and Jamie thought it was freaking hilarious. And there's even videos of like black people reacting to Tropic Thunder, and they love it, right? So it's like it depends on what was the intention
If
behind
people
it. And,
can tell that you're not taking it seriously,
yeah,
you can do so much stuff,
Yeah.
have so much fun, and that's
Well, yeah, but people, again, we go back to, and that's why people are suffering so much now, is because everyone takes themselves way too seriously. For example, something as simple as The Office, even the characters, like, we could not do that series today. But there's, like, hilarious elements, but they didn't take themselves seriously.
yeah.
you can't afford to make anybody look bad because
Yeah.
you have to empathize with everybody.
Well,
And that
exactly.
can also take the air out of your tires in terms of a story, because you can't have villains anymore.
Yeah.
Everybody has to be sympathetic.
Politically correct.
Right,
Or,
which that's making it, I think, increasingly difficult for content creators.
We even have to like Jeffrey Dahmer, apparently.
yeah, you would have to sympathize. Genuinely, you'd have to be like, well, we don't really know, like, what kind
That's-
of childhood he has, or we don't
Listen,
really know what state he was
Disney
in.
can pick this up right now. I'm pitching the next MCU character is just a serial killer. It's Jared's serial killer from the sketch we just
It's
did.
like the full-on inversion, just a complete inversion. Oh my goodness. Yeah, we're now the heroes are villains and the villains are heroes.
But artists predicted this. Like, if you look through
Yeah.
even films, like books.
If you look at postmodernist art, any other final thoughts about Halloween?
It's a fun holiday. I always find this time of the year I get a certain taste for the macabre. Everything around me is dying, and Halloween is just you need it. It just satiates. It's like all fall you're kind of craving
Pumpkin
this-
spice.
Yeah, you're just craving
That's
it.
Well,
the thing I
and-
really want.
And then Halloween just satiates that desire, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's like everyone has that melancholic, like, aspect to them, and there's this beauty in the grotesque aspect of things.
I just feel bad for all those sweet, nice goths that work at the Spirit Halloween. that'll just be like the unemployed elves of Santa's workshops after Christmas
That's a
with
perfect
nothing to
image.
do.
Well, yeah, there's like Christmas horrors too. Actually, maybe we should watch one of those.
I've heard they're really bad though.
They're mostly pure. I think I remember reading about one good one, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Till next.
Until next time.
We'll be back in December. No, I'm kidding. We'll be back next week with more. Tell all your friends. We're at the Forest Creek, most platforms, YouTube and Spotify and Instagram primarily. I looked into Twitter yesterday, or actually today, because today is the day Elon bought it and started firing everybody.
Set the birds free.
Yeah. Maybe I'll look into it again, but I can't imagine it's gotten any saner.
Well, I mean, I feel like everybody who's already been banned has probably moved to like Parler or found some other means, and
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe their life has gotten significantly better since being banned from Twitter. I wouldn't be surprised.
Kanye's looking for somebody new. I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call Kanye. Anyway, tell your friends at the Forest Creek, at the Real Forest Creek on YouTube, apparently.
So you have 2 different names for it then.
Listen, it's just the Forest Creek, and if I find the person who took at the Forest Creek on YouTube, I'm gonna write you a very sternly worded email and then an offer to buy it from you. In any case, yeah, we got some pretty fun sketches coming up.
Fun things coming.
A couple. We're gonna try to put them out before Halloween.
Really?
Yeah, if
Oh.
I can make you and Jared work hard enough.
I am very busy.
I don't care.
Help! Is anybody listening? Help!
Whether it is birds or smiles or jack-o'-lanterns or deadites or Jeffrey Dahmer or your unresolved trauma bonding issues, stop it. Face your fears. Bye.